Chancellor HNLU, and our chief guest, Dr. Abhishek Singhvi, Honorable Member of Parliament and Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India. A formal introduction of the dignitaries of today's memorial lecture will be made shortly. With the permission of the dignitaries, I would now proceed with today's session. HNLU has at its helm a renowned academician and an administrator, Professor Vivekanandan, as our Honorable Vice Chancellor. Professor Vivekanandan has 3 decades of teaching and research experience in legal education, particularly IP and intellect law, and has served at the National Law School, Bangalore, and Nalsar University of Law, Hyderabad. He was also the Dean at Rajiv Gandhi School of IP Law at Kharagpur and the founding Dean of School of Law, Bennett University. At Nalsar, he has also served at MHRD Chair Professor, and at HNLU, Sir has been spearheading numerous initiatives aimed towards ensuring that HNLU makes a mark in the international legal community. Sir, may I now invite you to deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Ms. Anita, for the introduction. Let me say a first warm good morning to all who have gathered in this virtual room. Let me first invite, as part of my welcome speech, our Honorable Chancellor and Chief Justice of Chhattisgarh, Sri Arup Kumar Goswami, who has kindly consented, even though this program was arranged in a little hurried fashion, but he had been gracious and kind enough to be part of this virtual program. Apart from our guest of honor, we have chief guest with us today, Dr. Abhishek Singhvi, who is a renowned advocate, a jurist, and third-time member of parliament in Rajya Sabha, and has been was also part of several standing committees, a writer. And he is here today with us to be part of this twin event, the first one being unveiling the statue of Mahatma Gandhi in the premise, virtual unveiling, and then second one to deliver the inaugural edition of the first Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Lecture he is going to deliver today on the topic of the pillars of democracy. So both of them are here with us. As briefly to touch upon for a minute, in 2019 when I took over, like everybody else, I was quite impressed about the architecture of the HNLU, which is a parliament modeled round building, and it was really imposing and fantastic. But we thought we still have to further improve upon the aesthetics of art and culture here, which is very important for universities, not merely classrooms. So this culminated when we met a couple of our alumni, interestingly, who are in the field of arts. And they first were invited to do some murals in the entrance of our main building. And it was so impressive. In the discussion, it emerged that the 4 entrances of this circular building had a huge space and can be adorned with, icons whom students can, admire, appreciate, and also can follow their teachings. So accordingly, we commissioned, 4 important things. One is Swami Vivekananda, and then another one is Dr. Ambedkar, and then Mahatma Gandhi and Justice Hidayatullah statue itself. As CM was kind enough sometime back to inaugurate the Swami Vivekananda statue and the governor on Ambedkar, we thought today we don't want to miss the Martyrs' Day as a memory of Mahatma Gandhi. We are here today, and the guest of honor and chief guest will do the honors of virtual opening. And with this, in a sense, we feel that we are increasing the aesthetic quotient of the campus, and which will serve as a very long way in terms of remembering the ideals by the students as well as all visitors. So let me conclude by welcoming, as we proceed with the anchor for other things, welcoming both our guest of honor and chief guest today for this very important function. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now invite Dr. Deepak Kumar Srivastava, Associate Professor and former Registrar and Controller of Examination of HNLU, to introduce the guest of honor for today's memorial lecture.
Thank you, Professor Anita. Respected Honorable Chancellor, sir, respected Abhishek Manu Singhvi ji, Honorable Vice Chancellor, sir, respected Registrar Professor Dr. Uday Shankar, sir, all deans of the university, all faculty members, and dear participants and students. Honorable Chancellor, sir, the introduction of Honorable Chancellor, sir. Honorable Chancellor, sir, born on 11/3/1961 at Jorhat, Assam. Sir graduated in economics honors from Cotton College under Guwahati University in 1981 and obtained LLB degree from Government Law College, Guwahati in 1985. Sir started his practice from 1985 and mainly on the area of civil law, criminal law, constitutional law, and service matters, and was designated as senior advocate by the Guwahati High Court on 21/12/2004. Sir was the executive chairman of Nagaland State Legal Services Authority from 1/4/2011 to 12/8/2013 and was the executive chairman of Arunachal Pradesh State Legal Services Authority from 2016 to 2019 and the executive chairman of the Assam State Legal Services Authority from 2018 to 2019. Sir was appointed as an additional judge of Guwahati High Court on 24/1/2011 and became a permanent judge on 7/11/2012. Sir was Chief Justice acting of Guwahati High Court from 2018 to 2018 and also from 24/5/2019 to 6/10/2019. Sir was appointed as the Chief Justice of High Court of Sikkim from 15/10/2019, transferred to High Court of Andhra Pradesh and assumed charge of the office of the Chief Justice, High Court of Andhra Pradesh on 6/1/2021. Thereafter, Sir was transferred to High Court of Chhattisgarh and assumed charge of the office of the Chief Justice of Chhattisgarh High Court on 12/10/2021 and the Chancellor of Hidayatullah National Law University. Sir is not having vast experience as an advocate, as a judge, but Sir is also represented Ranji Trophy from Assam and East Zone under 19 and under 22 at the senior level. Sir, we welcome you and thank you. Thank you, Anita ma'am.
Thank you, sir. May I now invite Dr. Avinash Samal, Dean, Social Sciences, HNLU, to introduce the chief guest for today's memorial lecture.
Thank you, Ms. Anita. Honorable Chief Justice of High Court of Chhattisgarh and Chancellor Justice Arun Kumar Goswami ji, Honorable Member of Parliament and Senior Advocate of Supreme Court, Dr. Abhishek Singhvi, Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Dr. V.C. Vivekanandan sir, respected Registrar Professor Uday Shankar, esteemed colleagues, staff, students of the university, respected dignitaries, and the guests. To begin with, I must say that it's a great privilege indeed to have with us Dr. Abhishek Singhvi to deliver the inaugural Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Lecture 2022 in the august presence of our Chancellor. To introduce Dr. Singhvi, I would like to mention that Dr. Singhvi holds an enviable record of being designated as the youngest senior advocate of the Supreme Court only at the age of 34 and later becoming the youngest additional Solicitor General at the age of 37. Currently, Dr. Singhvi is serving as a third-time member of Parliament. He is a former chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law and Justice and an erudite legal scholar. He is a well-known author and columnist and a visibly media personality. He is also the senior most serving national spokesperson of the Congress Party and a former vice president of the Supreme Court Bar Association. His numerous columns in Hindustan Times, Times of India, and elsewhere have been published in the form of two books called Candid Corner and Straight Talk, both with forwards from the former Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh. He is also, an occasional columnist who writes in major Hindi dailies such as Dainik Bhaskar, Rajasthan Patrika, etc. And he's also an author of innumerable articles on a wide diversity of legal and non-legal issues. And He publishes in several leading newspapers and journals. Singhvi's legal analysis of the law of emergency powers in a comparative common law perspective was recently released by the present Chief Justice of India and 3 other Supreme Court judges only in January 2021. Awarded the Global Leader for Tomorrow Award by the World Economic Forum Davos in 1999, Dr. Singh has been the opening lead speaker of the Treasury benches of the Congress in Parliament for almost every major debate from 2006 to 2013. He has been the common factor in almost all major, cases, Supreme Court cases, spanning constitutional law, corporate law, arbitration, and several other subjects over the last 4 decades. He has been serving on many parliamentary committees, those including on privileges, urban affairs, law, justice, and defense. He is also known for his social work, and he supports many charities with significant contributions, including a standalone prayer center for destitute children, the Singhvi Scholarship at Trinity College, Cambridge, an oxygen express van, and medical equipment for COVID and general assistance, and large contributions to the Supreme Court bar. This is apart from the sterling work that he has done over the last 12 years in Rajasthan from the MP-led funds, supporting at least 400 projects in the field of health and education. As far as his educational qualifications are concerned, he is a distinguished graduate from the prestigious St. Stephen's College in Delhi. Dr. Singhvi later obtained his master's degree and PhD from Trinity College, Cambridge. In addition to legal practice and politics, he also had a short stint at St. John's College, Cambridge as a teacher, and has done a brief summer program from the Harvard University. With this brief introduction, I welcome you to HNLUSA, and thank you. Ms. Anita, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Mahatma Gandhi single-handedly made non-violence a universal substitute for violence and the bedrock of his leadership. His non-violence was a way to counter injustice and exploitation and not to run away from a righteous battle. Humility to him is an indispensable test of ahimsa. 73 years have passed since India became independent, and yet these ideas remain as relevant today as they were back then. With these few words, I request my colleague, Dr. Ankit Awasthi, to kindly share the video of the virtual unveiling of the statue of Mahatma Gandhi. Thank you, sir. May I now invite the guest of honor of the inaugural Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Lecture 2022, Honorable Shri Justice Arup Kumar Goswami, Chief Justice of the High Court of Chhattisgarh and Chancellor of HNLU, to address the gathering.
Namaste and good morning to all. Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhi, Chief Guest of today's event, Professor Dr. V.C. Vivekanandan, Vice Chancellor of Hidayatullah National University of Law, Professor Uday Shankar, Registrar of the University, esteemed members of the faculty, dear students, respected members of staff, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I congratulate the university administration for the twin laudable events of virtual unveiling of the statue of Mahatma Gandhi and the first Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Lecture. It gives me immense pleasure to note that the sculptors, Sri Wilson John and Srimati Shashikanta Turkey, are alumni of this university. My best wishes to them. For the inaugural memorial lecture, we have with us Dr. Singhi, who has just been introduced by Dr. Samal. Dr. Singhi, welcome to our midst. Today marks the 74th death anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. The two cardinal principles of Gandhi's thought are truth and non-violence. For him, truth is a sovereign principle which includes numerous other principles. This truth is not only in truthfulness in words, but truthfulness in thoughts also. And not only the relative truth of a conception, but the absolute truth, the eternal principle. For him, when ahimsa becomes all-embracing, it transforms everything it touches. There is no limit to its power. Mahatma Gandhi was not only a political philosopher, but a unique thinker, and breadth of his vision encapsulated all aspects of human existence. With consummate ease, he translated his experimental learning of life to data-driven analytical prescription of life. He was a humanist for whom the welfare of human beings, not institutions or systems, was the paramount consideration and mattered most. And such sentiment finds echo when he had said, "Where there is love, there is life." My dear students, as you embark upon the journey of life, please remember what Gandhiji had said. Be the change that you wish to see in the world. We all yearn for happiness in life. Happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony. This is what Mahatma Gandhi had said about happiness, and which is so true. I have no hesitation in the mind that Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Lecture Series will generate a rich content of thoughts from scholarly and erudite speakers, which will contribute immensely in our public discourse. With these few words, I wish you all well and implore Almighty to bless you in abundance in the days to come. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. Without further ado, may I now invite to this virtual dais Dr. Abhishek Singhvi to deliver the inaugural Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Lecture 2022 on the topic of the pillars of Indian democracy.
Chancellor of the University and Honorable Chief Justice of Chhattisgarh, Justice Goswami, Vice Chancellor Vivekanandaji, distinguished members of the faculty, many of whom are on the screen, above all, students and participants. It is truly a pleasure and a privilege, especially in the context of association with two great names, one name for the millennium, for the world, and for India, Gandhi. The name which an equally illustrious global name, Einstein, said, to paraphrase, that future generations will scarcely believe that a man of this flesh and blood walked on earth. On his death anniversary, I would like to think that the more you kill Gandhi, the more Gandhian thought proliferates. The proliferation of his values, his symbolism, would in fact make the proliferation of the Omicron virus seem mild. Because Gandhi is irrepressible, irresistible, irrespective of age, culture, context. And he has therefore transcended so many things. In Muhammad Hidayatullah, we had a giant who strode the arena of law as a colossus. And that is the second great intersecting name relevant today. In fact, when at very short notice, Professor Vivekanand just a few days ago asked me, I recalled in my early days when I had applied for Trinity College, Cambridge. The admission was granted because I was a good student and I had topped the senior Cambridge exams in those days, class 11. But Cambridge then, and I think even today, requires a social certificate to certify that apart from being a good academic, you are, as they put it in those days, otherwise all okay. And I did some recce and I zeroed in on then retired Justice Hidayatullah. This was in the late 70s, very early 80s. He had been an illustrious alumnus of Trinity College, Cambridge, where I ultimately went. But before that, I approached him through my father, and readily he gave me a very generous social introduction and certificate, which was the requirement other than the academic ones for admission. In fact, in the late 80s and 90s, early 90s, when I had the occasion to do a lot of sal seed litigation arising from Madhya Pradesh, then undivided Madhya Pradesh, and Jabalpur High Court in particular, I had occasion also to visit Raipur. And I went to the Bar Association and also to the library. And I found the enrollment register in the Bar Association of Muhammad Hidayatullah. I still remember that visit. So these are two impressive sons of India who intersect in this great institution of HNLU. I think there are, apart from many other achievements of Professor Vivekanand and his team, I think there are two rarities of HNLU I thought I would underline in these opening remarks. Having been privileged to serve on the governing boards of the Delhi and the Jodhpur NLU, and Jodhpur in particular being my hometown, we fought and got the NLU there many years ago. Having served there, I am very impressed to note that HNLU has a 37% women faculty ratio, which I think is quite incredible by any average or by any standard in this country. And even more impressive, a 1:18 student faculty ratio, or rather faculty student ratio. Both are quite remarkable and unprecedented. And having emphasized in some of my lectures on legal education, including one recently at Jindal, I have partly jokingly, partly seriously always said that it is time this country had a school for law teachers, a law school only for law teachers, to produce law teachers or to mass produce them, because there is a real dearth of good law teachers. The third impressive facet of HNLU I found is that a large number of post-degree and research students, as many as 15, I am told, have joined the faculty of this university. And that, I think, is again a great achievement. In a lighter vein, I just heard Professor Vivekanand saying that the shape is like the Parliament building, the architecture. Purely in a lighter vein, and now that I'm on the Privileges Committee of Parliament for the second time, I don't think I'm committing any privilege of Parliament. I remember Pilu Modi, the irrepressible Pilu Modi's jest in Parliament once. He said that I hope and trust that the shape of the Parliament building does not resemble the sum total of its deliberations, which in Pilu Modi's style was one big zero. All parliamentarians took it in a good spirit, but the architecture really is unusual. Friends, why this topic? Pillars of Indian democracy. Well, this is the 75th year of our republic, the republic given to us by Gandhi and his colleagues, and all discussions in the 75th year on the issues which underlie our democracy, the values which underlie that, is something we must cherish. They are, of course, first and foremost, the values which Gandhi stood for. And I am going to discuss a series of non-institutional and institutional pillars of Indian democracy as the theme for today. Partly because we tend to take them for granted. And it's important not to take such things as for granted. And partly to suggest to you reforms required. The other relevance of this theme is that any dilution, any weakening, any undermining of these institutional and non-institutional pillars of Indian democracy has to be resisted by awareness first and foremost, and then by other means. And that's a very small price of eternal vigilance, which we must gladly pay to remind ourselves to reabsorb and to rekindle those pillars, be them institutional or be they non-institutional. Of course, if I was forced to prioritize, I would say that the non-institutional pillars are even more important than the institutional pillars of Indian democracy, but together they make our democracy what it is. Well, friends, before I get to the meat of the matter, let me start with a question which I have done for many foreign audiences, but also frequently for Indian audiences. It's a very oversimplistic, but a very interesting question. And that is this. Consider this conundrum, or what I think is a remarkable conundrum, almost a paradox, that between the 1930s and 60s, a rough period of about 25 to 30 years, approximately 30 odd countries, or maybe 40 odd countries, would have emerged from the yoke of imperialism. From Dutch imperialism, English imperialism, French imperialism, Portuguese imperialism, and so on and so forth. And they are spread across the landscape of Asia, Africa, Australasia, South America, a little bit in East Europe, but mostly in these areas. And the remarkable question is, not one of them, not one single one of them, barring India, has remained a vibrant, thriving democracy. Not in any of those landscapes. Indeed, if you look out of your window, you find littering the landscape of South Asia itself amidst our immediate neighborhood, the wrecks and ruins of constitutionalism. If you look farther, even amongst the so-called Southeast Asian tigers, you will find very little democracy, though great economic growth. Indeed, if you take away the imperialism tag and look at East Europe, which emerged from a different kind of imperialism, there again, you will hardly find any democracy, much less thriving democracy. So India and India alone is this remarkable exception, barring, of course, a short aberration, the emergency, which itself was, of course, a constitutional suspension of our rights, but still constitutionally ordained. So my question is, why? Why India alone? And my answer is that there is no satisfactory answer. My first and best genuine answer is sheer good luck. Sheer good luck. If one is pressed more and more for another answer, a more logical and a more descriptive answer, then I would say we got the sequencing right. Of course, we possibly got the sequencing right by luck, but we got the sequencing right. And by sequencing, I mean we got Gandhi followed by Nehru. Let me tell you, not entirely in jest, that if the sequencing was the reverse, the result might not have been so good, it might even have been disastrous. But Gandhi is the greatest agitational politician the world ever saw. And if you combine with that non-violence, then he's the greatest agitational politician. Without him, India could never get independence. And he's the only person I know who, to a limit or beyond limits, eliminated the hiatus between preaching and practice. He genuinely believed that if you preach, you have to practice. If you practice, you can preach only what you practice. I know of no other historical or contemporary figure who has carried this simple principle to such extremes. And today, on his death anniversary, you can show as many Godse movies as you like. But this astounding fact can never be detracted from this giant who strode our firmament. So the sequencing was Gandhi. But then we might not have continued as a democracy had he not been followed by a Nehru. Nehru could never alone by himself or with his other colleagues got us independence. And maybe Gandhi was too idealist to be the first Prime Minister of India had it ever happened like that. But Nehru, whom I consider the eternal liberal, left of center, Fabian romantic socialist, was possibly the best bet we could have had in the first 15 years of our nascent republic. And that is the 15 years during which you put your roots of the seed of Gandhi, got the roots of a full-blown, growing, flowering tree because of those first 15 years. It didn't happen in our neighborhood in Pakistan. It didn't happen on the other side of the neighborhood. It didn't happen in so many parts of the world. In all of those 30, 40 odd countries emerging from the yoke of imperialism. And therefore, we have this very interesting question, which I think is still not been the subject of a genuine, real PhD research as to how we happen to be the only country. Incidentally, as I leave the Gandhi theme, I must tell you that Gandhi had a very impish sense of humor, a very irreverent and a very impish. He ordered a new set of dentures before embarking on some of his most serious fasts unto death. So friends, let us now turn to those non-institutional and institutional pillars. The first of those non-institutional ones, as I said, if forced to choose, I would say the non-institutional ones are even more important than the institutional ones. The first of my pillars is secularism. India is the most diverse spot on planet Earth. Call it a melting pot or a salad bowl. I cannot think of a more diverse spot anywhere on planet Earth. 22 scheduled languages, 700 mother tongues, 2,000 dialects, the largest global population of 4 religions, the second largest population or the third largest, depending on when you count, of Muslims, races, smells, sounds, food, dress, ritual, a bewildering diversity in each of these. Therefore, in this context, secularism can never be a largesse for a country like India. It is, in fact, a self-preservatory ethic. In fact, given the Indian context, I have long believed that sometimes the more you pull, India is likely to snap. The more you let go, the more India soars. As you know, when you fire a kite, you are taught sometimes to let go and the kite soars higher. One of the best definitions of secularism, I have found one from an Indian professor at Harvard at one time, Professor Bhargav. He adapted the Lincolnian of the people, by the people, for the people, and asked the question that we can all understand by the people because they elect. We can understand for the people because democracy is supposed to work for them. But what did Lincoln mean by of the people? And then he answers his own question by saying that by of, according to him, it is meant to convey a sense of co-ownership of the nation and of polity. A sense of co-ownership which brings in inclusiveness, participatory inclusiveness. And that, I think, is the heart and soul of secularism. And don't forget, secularism trots along in our constitution along with two words like fraternity and equality. They are words which cross-fertilize each other. They have to be read teleologically and understood purposively. Yes, secularism arrived in the preamble later, in 1976. I find it amusing that there is a section of people who say that it is so inherent and obvious in India that the person who enacted, amidst a lot of black laws, when she enacted secularism as part of our preamble, should not have been done, need not be enacted. Something as basic, today as non-derogable and as inherent a jewel of our preamble and therefore part of our basic structure, ought not to have been enacted because of stating the obvious is a proposition I do not and can never agree with. Because of this secularism and now an article of faith in our constitution, India can never afford to look upon its citizens, any section of them, irrespective of any of those diversities of race, religion, color, etc. They can never be looked upon as licensees living at others' sufferance. India cannot afford for a self-preservatory ethic alone, for self-centeredness and selfishness for the nation alone, leave aside gifting something to someone. It can never afford to impose uniformity upon diversity in place of unity in diversity. These are things you have to guard against. And in this context, irrespective of political color, I'm eschewing all politics, any degree of hate speech or divisiveness cannot be tolerated or countenanced. Whether it comes from those who exercise wealth, power, or patronage, whether it comes from this or that political color, from this or that class, this cuts at the root of all those words in our preamble, and especially secularism, fraternity, equality. And when such instances happen, more or less, when the majority and the rest of us keep silent, it's not because they agree at all, even impliedly. The silence may be for a number of reasons, indifference or fear. Then I don't think the culpability is any less. Because, as that famous saying goes, that they first came for the Jews and I did not speak up. And then they came for the Christians and I did not speak up. And then they came for my neighbors and I did not speak up. And finally they came for me and there was no one left to speak up for me. So unless, friends, we remind ourselves of the lessons of history, we shall forever be condemned to repeat its errors. My second pillar, non-institutional still, of democracy is federalism. And it's a fascinating, and you'll notice that I'm going to be doing the job of a fan dancer. It's a very large canvas. I'm going to touch upon some of these without at all covering them or pretending to cover them. But it's still important to remind us of each of these pillars. Federalism is a very interesting journey from a unitary constitution to what people suppose is a quasi-federal system, to what has now in fact become in practice a highly federal system. It has been called in fact inadvertent federalism, never really imagined by our founders. Interestingly, federalism is the one word not used anywhere in the world's amongst the longest constitution, which is the Indian Constitution. There's a lot of, if you Google search it, you'll find federal in the context of federal court or judges having the same terms as the federal court. But there is no word of federalism in the entire constitution. It's quite amazing. And yet that word is now part of the basic structure since Bombay at least in 1993-94. When our founders sat together, and they were the wisest of people India could ever find in a collectivity before or after, they were rightly concerned about the fissiparous and disintegrating tendencies of the nascent, yet to be born Indian Republic. So while straining for federalism, wanting federalism, they rightly chose unitarism because they were genuinely scared and they just witnessed the horrors of partition. So they designed something which was a unitary constitution. In any case, they never thought of true federalism, much less any other kind of federalism like the US model. As you know, in US, many states, for example, Texas or Louisiana, were independent countries, which then gave up their sovereignties to merge into a federation. That's true federalism of the extreme kind. India, on the contrary, created a unitary constitution largely, at least in conception and design, by the framers. And the debates make it clear. A Oxford academic who's an Australian but taught at Oxford, Kenneth Weir, on the very day of India's independence on 26th, he wrote an article on 28th of January, which was reproduced in the Hindustan Times last week, just before our 26th January. He coined the phrase which became famous. He was being polite. It was actually a unitary constitution. He said, at best, India is a quasi-federal constitution. That is pretending to be a little bit federal, but mostly unitary. Well, friends, I'm going to give you 6 developments which have in fact made it remarkably federal in operational reality, despite the design being there, the one which we created. Of those 6, the first is linguistic federalism, the reorganization of our states in the mid-50s. Made our country much more federal. It decentralized merely by a linguistic definition of states. And people of today's generation do not remember, but people of that generation remember the language wars of the 50s and even the 60s. Then came the 3-language formula. And the 3-language formula, for all its critics and all its fanatic supporters, has stood the test of time. And it has led to genuine decentralization. What I call linguistic federalism, of course, as members of parliament or otherwise, we have a Hindi Salakar Samiti and we get large reams of paper in Hindi. And there are Hindi propagation weeks, etc. But let me tell you in practice, without wanting to sound irreverent, all the 70 years of government attempts to impose Hindi or to promote Hindi, they would have achieved far less, a fraction of what the media explosion has achieved. It is actually the media explosion of Hindi channels, and the numbers are humongous. which has popularized Hindi as a bolchal ki bhasha across India. In the good old days when I went into public life, there were no OB vans, and my friends from the south would go naturally in the studios and talk in whatever tutti frutti Hindi because they were not made conscious of the fact that they were from the south and could not speak Hindi in the Hindi channels. And Hindi has therefore grown mainly not because of government efforts, irrespective of which government, but of the media explosion in the vernacular and, of course, in regional languages. The second reason for inadvertent and what is called unintended federalism is vigorous and accelerated judicial review. Prior to 2000, there were just under 100 invocations of 356. As you know, 356 is supposed to be the biggest inroad into federalism. After that, post 2000, there are probably between 12 to 15. The reason is not a change in political will or desire. The reason is not only court intervention, but quick, timely, and remedial court intervention. Remember, Bommai, when it happened, Hegde got virtually little solace because the judgment came 4 years afterwards, after the assembly and the government had changed twice over. So it was a declaration of law without any actual remedy to the aggrieved party. Even when Rameshwar in Bihar happened post 2000, the judgment was faster, but it still took a year and a half by which governments had changed. The fruits of the delinquency had been enjoyed by the delinquents, and the courts were only giving sermons or declarations of law, no doubt valuable for future case law precedent, but still academic for the case at hand. So there was no pragmatic remedy and no punitive bite in the teeth. That has changed dramatically, which is the reason for federalism to flourish. You have had now, and I must say as an aside that I've had the privilege of being associated in the lead counsel with each of these cases. Karnataka won the midnight hearing. Remember that? Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Uttarakhand, Karnataka 2 more recently, Goa, Arunachal Pradesh. Invalidation sought of delinquent action has been swift, prompt, and restoration of status quo ante has been swift and prompt. Micromanagement by the courts, Supreme Court, has meant that you think 5 times before you intervene by defections, by 356s, by destabilizations, by change of government. The third contributor to inadvertent federalism has been Panchayati Raj. Based upon the Dr. L.M. Singhvi report on revitalization of Panchayati Raj in the late 80s, in 1991, we had 71 and 72 constitutional amendment. It's the most incredible charter for decentralization. When I, as a member of parliament, go and sit for a MPLED project in rural Rajasthan, more often than not, the lady sitting across the table is a woman, is not a man. The person sitting across the table is a woman. You cannot imagine, despite all the, of course, the infirmities which are still there, no doubt, but you cannot imagine more than or approximately 2 million women heads of decentralized governance at the taluka tehsil, at the district and at the state level. This is a revolution. In fact, the only revolution left in this sector now is that they must obey and implement the list system, which is there in the 7th schedule for the central and the state government. There are similar lists supposed to be made between the state and the panchayat system. But there, states have been very hesitant and jealous of giving up their powers to panchayats. So very few subjects are devolved. But there is still, therefore, this third factor, which our framers never thought of, but has created inadvertent federalism. The fourth is economic liberalization. Doesn't matter whether you date it to 1985 or 1991. I would personally think that 85 was the start of the spirit of liberalization. But delicensing, fully consummated by 1991, has a direct contribution to federalism. Let me give you 2 seemingly superficial but practical examples. Today, industrialists or persons do not need to visit Delhi if they are located in Bombay, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, wherever. Hardly once in 6 months, because the central government actually has very little power of controlling your industry. They still have to visit a lot to the state government. And I always jokingly tell some of my friends, including your state chief minister, that a state chief minister today is 3 times more powerful than a cabinet minister at the center, if not 5 times. Because with delicensing, decentralization, whatever red tape is there is much more at the state level than at the central level. And that is again an example of decentralization. In the old days, a chief minister of a state, howsoever big, used to need to get permission to have a road show to invite investment to a state. There was no concept of vibrant Gujarat and vibrant Chhattisgarh. This is decentralization. The fifth is fiscal federalism. When our founders created the republic, the shareable tax revenue and the grants, which are the two components, would have been 10 to 20%. I don't know the exact figure. They rose and remained for a long time at 30%. That means the total devolution. And without fiscal federalism, you don't have the money, then there is no true federalism for the states. That figure is now just under 45%. And it is likely to grow to 50% if some of the recommendations of the Finance Commission are met. So let's see, 45% of the funds received by the center are devolved either by way of shareable tax revenue or grants to the state. You cannot imagine the effect of this fiscal federalism. None of this was even thought of by our framers. And last but not the least, something which we consider the sixth factor, which we consider chaos and cacophony, which we consider some degree of anarchy, but is actually a very great achievement of federalism, is the emergence of regional parties, especially in the last 15 years, the watershed year being the 1991. Regional parties are a very significant vehicle for regional aspirations and for true federalism at the ground. And as I end on federalism, why I have spent so much time on this second non-institutional pillar of Indian democracy is because federalism has been traditionally the best vehicle to manage diversities. Federalism provides a shared identity without which governance would become monopolistic and unilateral, too centralized. Federalism is in fact a safety valve, the kind which you see in the kitchen on the pressure cooker. It's a safety valve which regulates at the subunit, the state unit level, the 3 Ds. The Ds of dissent, discomfort, and dissatisfaction. It allows you to vent these at decentralized levels and thereby, in fact, prevents bigger conflagrations and explosions at the center. It channels them into manageable outlets of constitutional solutions, and somebody has rightly written, it therefore quarantines conflicts at the state level or sub-state level. This is written before COVID, by the way, instead of allowing it to emerge as a flashpoint at the center. Well, friends, my third pillar is an institutional pillar. How much time do I have? I still have about 15 minutes. I'll try to keep to that time. Parliamentary democracy is the third one. Remember, 2 words are there, not 1 word. Parliament and democracy. So we don't only have a democracy, we're supposed to have a parliamentary form of democracy. Not a presidential, not a monarchical, not any other form. What is the essence and what are the reforms here? The essence is what I see in Central Hall. Something we take for granted, we have to cherish, and it is diminishing. It is diminishing every day. Again, I'm not talking of political color. There is a secular linear decline. And that is Central Hall's spirit of openness, candor, magnanimity. You know, when you sit there and you have a Singhvi sitting here or a Rajnath sitting there or a Derek O'Brien sitting on the third thing or anybody else, there is complete openness, discussion. the rule in Central Hall is off the record. So I asked myself the question, could Ziaul Haq and Nawaz Sharif sit ever in their Central Hall? Could the two ladies of Bangladesh sit in their Central Hall? Would Vajpayee telephone Sonia Gandhi when he demits office or vice versa? Would that happen in the neighboring countries, immediate neighbors? Well, then it's a value we have to cherish. We can't take it for granted. And therefore, the increasing narrow-mindedness or trust deficit, which has been seen over the years, over the decades, is something which I detest. And I would very strongly want us all to nurture this, the concept of magnanimity, cross-party linkages, etc. Friends, Parliament at work is Parliament in committee. What you see in Parliament, the distressing scenes, just the exact opposite works in committee. I've had the privilege of chairing the Parliamentary Committee on Law more than a decade ago. And you'll be amazed at the remarkable work, the actual textually remarkable work, the research, and the unanimity or the convergence you have. There was a proposal at one time to bring the TV cameras to the committee, rightly rejected by the chairman of our house at that time. The day that happens, even parliamentary committees will get completely undermined. But a large number of the ills you see in the main chamber are actually eschewed and do not exist when the committees work. We have to enhance that. We have to nurture and promote that. There is a decline, and therefore we have to guard against that. Parliament does multiple roles. A, it passes laws. B, it is supposed to be a forum for fierce and free discussion. Fearless, fierce and free. C, it is supposed to represent the will of the people because it is their representatives who pass the laws. And 4, in a more macro general sense, it has been referred to as the grand inquest of the nation. It is the ultimate temple of democracy which does the inquest. Well, 2 things about parliamentary reform which I'd like to touch in this short time available on each head. One is that we do not have, and this is a part of the presidential system we can transplant even in a parliamentary system as a reform measure. We have no system in the British Westminster style of allowing initiation of laws by individual MPs. That's a huge, huge drawback. It stultifies creativity, constructive reform. There is, of course, a small theoretical exception, private members' bill on Friday afternoons. But that's only a theoretical, it's just to let off steam. And barring 4 bills in 70 years, all the bills are withdrawn ultimately by saying that, yes, taken on record, etc., but nothing happens. So initiation of legislation through members of parliament is something we should think about. With some limits, despite the cabinet nature of the governments, we should be able to do it by suitable amendments. But it's a structural thing which we need to think about deeply because there's a lot of creativity out there in members, contrary to what you might think. But it is just not done because, the government of the day initiates legislation. The second is a reform of the whip. Same thing, the whip kills creativity. The whip is supposed to whip you into attendance, but it actually whips you out of creativity. Now, what you can do is a simple amendment, keep the whip for any actually designated no confidence motion or a similar kind of a money bill motion, where a whip is important to maintain the flock and not have repeated collapses. But there's no reason to have the whip for everything. Today, the whip is used for everything. You should be able to say what you like, do what you like, within the house at least, irrespective of the whip, unless it involves a confidence motion. This is the second major reform, structural, we have to think about. It sounds very out of place in the parliamentary Westminster model, but it's something important for creativity and initiative and constructive work. Of course, the third, most important is the disruptions you see. But I would say that even equally important is the fact that our state assemblies, parliament sits for about under 5 months. I'm not talking of COVID. but about otherwise 5 months. State assemblies, I believe the last figure I checked, the highest is 20 days a year. Most sit for 10 days. Rajasthan stretched it to 20 some time ago. This has to change. For parliamentary democracy and the temple of democracy to be in parliament, you have to sit longer and more frequently. For disruptions, it's a question of who will guard the guardians, because the people are the same who has to punish, who has to regulate, and it's difficult to be tough. But I think there is no option except automatic suspension followed by a direct cut in allowances and pay. It sounds harsh. Last point on parliamentary democracy is disqualification for criminal activity. I don't agree with this judicial incrementalism by which judiciary keeps on prescribing or suggesting or sermonizing about disqualifications. They are imprecise and ambiguous. You need a simple legislative test so that everybody knows where they stand. Now, to suggest that I'm disqualified because a mere FIR is filed against me is ridiculous. But equally, to suggest that I can be disqualified only upon conviction, and conviction in India frequently means eternity, is equally problematic. So, what is the reasonable mean between these two extremes? Well, there should be a simple legislative test and not individual judicial judgments, which say that framing of charges, a test, cumulatively by a court, not filing a charge sheet, but framing of charges, and that too in a small list of serious offences, which can be specified by legislation. Murder, rape, etc. There can be a choice. That way, you do control criminality in politics to some extent without making it imprecise, ambiguous, and uncertain. The next, of course, institutional pillar is judiciary. A most remarkable one with the highest trust quotient, highest relative to other organs of governance. It is the pride of our national polity. It is known, Indian judiciary has created the most avant-garde doctrines known to mankind. PIL. For that matter, basic structure. Can you imagine any country saying that a constitutional amendment can be unconstitutional? And the judicial review, which our judges, forget the Supreme Court, even the High Court level, exercise, as I always say, would make Chief Justice Madison in Marbury and Chief Justice Marshall in Marbury and Madison blush. Your power of judicial review are humongous. What are the twin evils, if you were asked to identify twin evils? One, the scourge of arrears, backlog, pendency. The second, lack of mechanisms, mark the word I'm saying, mechanisms, to deal with integrity issues. On arrears, I can only quote Nani Palkiwala, who used to say that words have to be an assault in the senses for reform to happen. And he, of course, has given a very interesting, almost 30-year-old quote, which I hope I can find in a second for you. Just give me a second. I won't read the whole quote. It is a bit long, but it conveys the sentiment, and howsoever insulting it might sound, the sentiment has to be said. Because as I said, words have to be an assault on the senses for reform to take place. May I now turn to, I quote, may I now turn to the situation in India, which is the second largest number of lawyers in the world. This Palkiwala wrote more than 30 years ago. You can imagine the situation today. While it is true that justice should be blind, in our country it is also lame. It barely manages to hobble along. The law may or may not be an ass, but in India it is certainly a snail. It moves so slowly that it might be considered too slow in a community even of snails. A lawsuit once started in India is the nearest thing to eternal life ever seen on this earth. Some people say that litigation in India is a form of fairly harmless entertainment. Well, if so, it seems to be a very expensive way of keeping the citizenry amused. If litigation were to be included in the next Olympics, India would be quite certain of winning at least one gold medal. Palkiwala did not know that 20 years after his death, the arrears before COVID, and the Chief Justice of the High Court would know it better than anybody else because he gets these figures. Before COVID, all India was 3 crores plus, just over 3 crores. The figure a few months ago published in the Supreme Court is 4.10 crores. A net addition of 1.1 crores during the 2 years of COVID. At any point of time, in our 75 years, 1/3, sometimes even more than 1/3, 40%, of the 1,070 odd high court seats across the country for a country of 125 crores, sorry. 1/3 of the entire high court strength of 1,070, 1,080 has been vacant. 1/4 of the 22,000 seats in the lower judiciary, all India, have been vacant at any point of time. Our judge per million population ratio was and continues after increase to be the lowest in the world for a country which has a judiciary of the kind India does. It was 10 per million of population in 86, 87. By repeated Supreme Court directions over 12 years, there are about 20 orders, it has crawled up to 19 point something or 20 per million. USA has 50 per million. The minimal ideal is considered 35 to 40. The simple point is that you can have patients, you can have equipment, you can have hospital buildings. If you have no doctors, how will the medical system work? If you have no judges, there is no question. It's as simple as that. Something so obvious doesn't require any rocket science. Fiscal impact of legislation was started quite a while ago. At the end of our bills as parliamentarians, we get that sheet which says the fiscal impact is so much. But there is no quantitative assessment even now, though a lot of talk has gone on. I spoke on this almost 10 years ago. There is no quantitative assessment sheet accompanying any bill which comes to parliament. The result is that now after 30, 40 years, parliament is seeking, and we have actual proposals, to relook and amend 498A and 138, which have statistically and quantitatively found to be the biggest cloggers. Chief Justice Ramanna a few days ago pointed out a similar thing about the bail backlog in Bihar arising from prohibition law. Now, a quantitative assessment of what you are passing in parliament or at state assemblies is again part of the system for dealing with the scourge of backlog and arrears. Every major high court and smaller high courts have between 30 to 50% of their seats vacant. The irony and the joke is that they are even 30 to 50% of the unincreased original strength vacant. After that, you've increased the strength. There's no question of the strength being anywhere near full. There are a number of cases which come to the courts in the Supreme Court, and this is specific to the Supreme Court, where 2 judges, after hearing at length, refer to 3 judges. They, after hearing at length, refer to 5 judges, occasionally 7. That process, by the time 5 or 7 decide the difference, takes a minimum of 10 years. Has anybody thought of the progeny created at the High Court level in those 10 years of uncertainty and confusion of case law? A classic example, to take 1 out of 20 examples, is arbitration law, where I had occasion to appear, is the time period between Bhatia and Balco. For law students, I'll not go into details, you understand the difference between Bhatia and Balco. But in between Bhatia and Balco, which is supposed to have set the law right, the progeny across the high courts is hundreds and thousands of cases. Ultimately, we have to look at simple and seemingly drastic solutions. 224 capital A, since the inception of the 60s, has hardly been used 5 or 6 times in the Supreme Court for ad hoc judge appointment, and maybe not more than 5 or 7 times in the high courts. It's a very powerful provision. It allows even a high court to get a judge on an ad hoc basis from another high court, subject to Chief Justice and government consent. Never used. Well, in the Indian context of politics, once we select a person, 5 persons of a particular high court as suitable for appointment, the politics which starts in the bar, outside the bar, on the bench, and up to the central government, which delays those appointments for 1 or 2 years. Here you have a pool of tried and tested judges to be appointed as ad hoc judges. They are happy to continue and deal with 20-year-old civil appeals and criminal appeals. But you don't appoint them. You never used this power or hardly used it. I was very proud and happy to note that Justice Kaul in a recent judgment has quoted my very old article on this subject and referred to it in a very strong judgment saying, why is ad hoc judicial appointments not done? I know I'm speeding a bit because I'm conscious of the time. Just give me a few minutes more. I had the privilege of being part of a Chief Justice Ahmadi committee in the late 90s when we studied the Californian system. The Californian system is the originator of ADR, what you now call mediation, conciliation, etc. And this is they started in the 70s. We studied them, and our study led to a report, which with a few years delay was implemented in 1999 and led to Section 89 of the CPC, where we gave a menu card, which you now have of Lok Adalat, peculiar to India, mediation, conciliation, which is now more or less the same, and other forms of dispute resolution outside the courts as another way to declog the arterial, to bypass the arterial clogging. But we found that in the Californian study, the highest rate of success is judicial settlement by a sitting judge. In our report, we have written, this is way back in the 90s, that we wish we could suggest that for India. In fact, we suggested it indirectly, but we said there are not enough judges to do your work on the court. There is a question of a judge, of course, not the trial judge, but a judge other than the trial judge, sitting for judicial settlement, which is mediation, because statistically it is still found that clients are most inclined to settle before a judicial authority. But we don't have the manpower. These are things we have to think about. These are things we have to work on. The next pillar, institutional pillar, is media. And although I will rush, I cannot leave without this. The most unaccountable, the least prone to internal reform. Not its worst critics, and I am a very trenchant critic, would suggest external reform, interference, or censorship. But that heightens the need for internal self-reform, which is just not happening. There is much more of sense, much more of sensationalism, much less of sense. No sense, much sensationalism. They are the judge, jury, promoter, and prosecutor and executor. There are, at last count, it's a little dated figure, 400 plus, 515 plus TV channels, 500 million peak time viewing. I think it's probably 600 million now. 100 to 150 million copies of diverse newspapers in this country. 872 permitted satellite channels. Imagine the humongous reach of this pillar of Indian democracy. The point here is the first and biggest fraud is TRP. TRP is a toxic triangle of viewership, ratings, and ad revenue. It should get the Nobel Prize for miniaturization because hardly 30,000 to 40,000 meters in a country of 125 crores are, and that too strategically placed, are used to decide what viewers want. Don't take it lightly because these readings of TRP then go to decide content. And content, that's why I call it a toxic triangle. It's a cocktail of motivated stands, premeditated stands, ambitious anchors, occasionally insidious government interference, public baying for blood. It's a heady cocktail which any manufacturer of whiskey or rum would envy. That is what the media has come to now. And unless and until you reform the TRP by an independent regulator, where a conspiracy of silence is operating. The second thing is our regulator on the old English concept of peer regulation, the Press Council of India, has become worse than a toothless tiger. A toothless tiger can at least roar, though it can't bite. The PCI can neither roar nor bite. And the broadcasting bill, which has been lying in Parliament for 22 years, is another conspiracy of silence because it demarcates Chinese walls for conflicts of interest between ownership and media running. It doesn't, none of these things suit anybody, and therefore I have said in a recent Jethalani Memorial lecture that we know the global scourge of terrorism, but we ignore in the media verbal terrorism, visual extremism, and content fundamentalism. This is a pillar of our democracy, make no mistake about it, but totally unaccountable and least subject to regulation. The Election Commission, the next pillar of India's democracy, is India's pride. It's the world's envy, but it has to guard against politicization. You have to guard against, because remember, free and fair elections, that goes into democracy, and both have been held from 1975, Indira Nehru, Gandhi versus Raj Narayan, to be basic structure. This is the bedrock on which our basic structure stands of democracy, free and fair elections. So the moment any politicization or political interference or ex-bureaucrats who have been very active in some political management in their earlier avatars are appointed there, you will have a non-level playing field. And a can you hear me and see me? I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You can
Just a few seconds.
Yeah, slight glitch. Well, let me not take time on the CAG and the army, which are my last two pillars of Indian democracy. I will not labor on that except point out one thing, that A, the greatest armor of the army is anonymity. The day we start diluting the anonymity of the army, we are going to weaken this greatest pillar of Indian democracy, one of the greatest pillars of Indian democracy. Let me also say here, it might sound drastic and blanket, but there is a time now to do by legislation a complete elimination of post-retirement appointments for 3 or 4 bodies: Army, Election Commission, CAG, and I would add Judiciary. Now, let me tell you, I have a caveat here. You must put this ban on post-retirement employment, and I define employment in the widest way, by first increasing the age significantly. As chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Law, a specific report I authored which recommended increase of this, what I call the age arbitrage between High Court judges and Supreme Court judges, the 62 to 65 arbitrage. It's the most ridiculous concept. But you'll be amused to find that in the responses we got in this parliamentary committee, some responses said, yes, of course you should increase the age from 62 to 65, but why not increase Supreme Court judges to 67? And the other response we got was the bureaucrats should also be increased. Till you increase the bureaucrats, don't increase the 62 to 65. As a matter of fact, all should be 70 uniformly, according to me, given our life expectancy figures now. But at least 65. And let me tell you, as everybody who is in part of the profession knows, the elimination of this age arbitrage will automatically eliminate many prevalent malpractices also, which are gendered by this age arbitrage and for which I have no time to go into. Well, friends, now in conclusion, and genuinely in conclusion, but it will take 2 minutes more. I have done, as I told you, with apologies and with seeking your forgiveness, a fan dancer's job. I have touched upon the subject without really covering it because it's too vast a canvas. But let me tell you, personally, I believe that India's amazing diversity is perhaps its best kavach, its best insurance against degeneration of democracy or institutionalization of dictatorship. The intrinsic nature of India and Indians is, in fact, argumentative, absorbing, individualistic, and therefore, I think democracy cannot easily be in danger. Our democracy and Gandhi's vision of that democracy, of course, has many, many miles to walk and many, many promises to keep. It cannot be castigated completely as an imperfect democracy, but equally it cannot be lauded as a perfect or even a near perfect one. Gandhi today, had he been alive, would have been rightly both happy and sad. Indeed, as you know, even in 1948, he was of the view that most political parties should be wound up, starting with the Congress. That's an official view he wrote. But despite all roadblocks, all pessimisms, despite feeling that he was in a minority of one, lonely and alone, Gandhi would never have stopped in nudging, indeed pushing us to make an India of our dreams. He would have simply picked up the phrases from the man who conferred upon him the title of Mahatma. He would have said, Ekla chalo. Or he would have quoted Iqbal. मैं अकेला ही चला था जानिबे मंजिल, लोग आते रहे और कारवां बनता रहा. Gandhi was an eternal optimist, so he would not have chosen the alternative formulation of Iqbal, which equally was meant as a warning to all. Iqbal had also said, the same Iqbal, एक ख्वाब सा देखा था ताउम्र नींद आई, लम्हों ने खता की, सदियों ने सजा पाई. That's what I meant when I said that if you do not learn the lessons of history, you will be condemned to repeat its errors. Instead, Gandhi would have persisted tenaciously and doggedly, reminding us, as he did in those famous words, that every reform movement must pass through the tortuous journey of 5 stages. And this is true of all the 6, 7, 8 institutions, pillars, non-institutional pillars I have talked about. He said that, this is Gandhi's own words, it should pass through the tortuous journey of 5 stages: indifference, ridicule, abuse, repression, but finally respect and acceptance. No better tribute to Gandhi can be thought of except to resolve to undertake this obstacle course despite the obstacles, and to do the reform we can and should. Thank you very much. I am extremely sorry to have exceeded my time limit, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, sir. We could not have asked for a more befitting lecture today than to hear you speaking about the different pillars of democracy and giving your insights into the same. Thank you, sir, again for an engaging and an enlightening lecture. I now request our Honorable Vice Chancellor to kindly share his concluding remarks on today's session.
Thank you, Ms. Anita. My remarks is just 1 minute of the time. Firstly, our guest of honor, Honorable Chief Justice and Chancellor, made 2 salient things in his short and sweet address. One is the central theme of truthfulness as a very important message to the younger as well as the older audience here. Truthfulness as the central theme, which is easier said than practiced, and what more than Mahatma Gandhi's life and teaching. The second one, he talked about first practice and then preach when he quoted, be the change you want to see the world. And these 2 things were very, very crucial message. We do wish that things will improve, and we'll have the Chancellor present in our campus to interact and also to mentor young lawyers who are coming. So from my side, it's from my position as the Vice Chancellor, a great many thanks to him for being here. And of course, when about our chief guest talk today, in 2 planes he was connecting dots, I call it. One was very personal dots, And I was very surprised, elated to know about the letter of recommendation from none other than Justice Hidayatullah at a point of time. And then he comes here to deliver the lecture with Justice Hidayatullah University virtually. Is an important, interesting dot. You call it as providence or coincidence. And my interesting sharing with him was I knew more about Justice Hidayatullah when I first joined in 1990 as a teacher in National Law School, Bangalore, when Dr. Menon inaugurated the Moot Court Hall, which is named after Justice Hidayatullah, which stands tall today. And at that time, he was also present. And that was a very, very interesting facet for me as a dot. I am back in Hidayatullah National University. Of course, the main content is such a wide canvas. And only I think Justice Mr. Abhishek Singhvi can only do in his inimitable style about the various non-institutional pillars, because all the institutional pillars, we have enough textbooks in the library to read. It is the non-institutional pillars which he says that will finally guard the structural pillars. And that was fascinating journey which he went on from secularism to federalism to parliamentary democracy. And then he talked about, various aspects candidly because of his wide experience, not just as a senior advocate, also being part of policy making. That was wonderful. We only say that it is not the past dots, there are also future dots. I'm pretty sure we'll be having Dr. Singhvi in the campus sooner or later to share, and he has never shunned away from those things. I remember almost 20 years back, I escorted him from the city office of Nalsar to the campus when I took him to interact with students. And it was an interesting journey about its courts and things like that. And students wouldn't let him go at that point. This about 2 decades back. And again, the dot is connected. I felt that is here today. Sir, we are very happy and grateful to you. And of course, there will be a formal word of thanks now from my colleague registrar, Professor Uday Shankar. I leave the thing to the anchor now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now invite Professor Dr. Uday Shankar, Registrar of HNLU, to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Anita. I offer homage to all who have sacrificed their lives to see free and independent India on this Martyrs' Day. What could be a better way to pay tribute to the sacrifices made by our freedom fighters by an educational institution than to organize an academic discourse on Gandhi and his influence on the institutions of governance. It is my honor and privilege to extend vote of thanks to all the dignitaries on behalf of the university. Let me place on record humble gratitude to our guest of honor, Justice Arup Kumar Goswami, Honorable Chancellor and the Chief Justice, High Court of Chhattisgarh. The university has always received patronage from the Honorable Chancellor. Sir, the university looks forward for your guidance and encouragement in its entire endeavor. On behalf of HNLU fraternity, I also thank our chief guest, Sri Abhishek Singhvi, Senior Advocate and Member of Parliament. Sir, we are grateful to you for accepting our invite to deliver the inaugural edition of Memorial Lecture initiated on the day of death anniversary of Bapu, when we remember sacrifices of our forefathers. Your articulated thoughts on this solemn day will go a long way in inspiring young minds and to commit to the cause of the nation. I hope that the situation returns to normalcy and we welcome you in the university in near future. Let me also take the opportunity to express our gratefulness to Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor V.C. Vivekanandan, for inspirational leadership. Sir, on behalf of all of us, I'm thanking for conceptualizing the idea of having a statue of inspirational persons in the academic block of the university. Keep on motivating HNLU family, sir. My thanks to Professor Anita and Professor Ankit for steering the event. Also, on behalf of the university, I thank the students, faculties, and staff for joining the inaugural edition of the Memorial Lecture through virtual mode. The traditional practice of thanking would be incomplete if I failed to acknowledge the hard work of the IT team and other support team of the university for unwavering support. Towards the end, I profoundly thank the distinguished dignitaries for accepting our invite to unveil the statue of Mahatma Gandhi in the academic block of the university in virtual mode and sharing their thoughts on this occasion. Thank you all. Have a nice day.
Thank you, sir. With this, we conclude the inaugural Mahatma Gandhi Memorial Lecture of 2022. Once again, I, on behalf of HNLU, thank the dignitaries for giving us their valuable time. With your permission, sir, I would like to close today's session.
So, Chancellor, sir, we are closing the meeting today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.